Welcome to the CXO and CHRO Walk into a Bar, where we share insights at the intersection of talent and revenue. Dive into a unique narrative with our hosts, Michelle Strasburger, the insightful CHRO, and Dominique Sanfleur, the visionary CXO. Together, they bring dynamic perspectives that ignite thought-provoking dialogue from the C-suite. Each week, join us for electrifying sessions that confront the very challenges modern CXOs navigate in today's fast-paced business landscape. When split-second decisions loom, must it be talent or revenue that takes the hit? Or is there a harmonious crossroad where both can thrive? Can we blur the lines between talent and revenue? In every episode, we provide executive leaders with 3 strategic takeaways, transformative insights that will propel you to master the delicate balance between people and profit. It's not about winners or losers, but crafting an environment where everyone triumphs. Tune in and step closer to redefining executive success.
Hey, it's Thursday.
Thursday. Happy Thursday.
Happy Thursday. It feels like yesterday was just Thursday.
I know. Every week it feels like that because we look forward to this. That's why.
That is true. That is definitely true.
Every week.
Absolutely.
And I'm really looking forward to this topic.
This one, we've had a lot of good topics. But I think whenever we have an opportunity to blame somebody, I think it's always fun.
I love blaming somebody.
So I think we're gonna jump in to see who's to blame for bad culture. I think it's an interesting
bad culture.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I don't think it's too obvious either. Based on some of the perspectives that we've shared. So happy to dive into that.
No, who's to blame for bad culture? So welcome and please join in the conversation. I'm Michelle Strasburger. I'm the CEO of HR Rebooted, where we work with organizations to build intentional cultures so you can scale your organization without losing your soul.
Absolutely. And I'm Dominique Sanfleur, CEO of Intramark. We provide leaders with early visibility into people factors that disrupt execution.
So who do you blame for bad cultures, Dom?
You can blame me, but I don't think that's going to get most organizations far. But I think to kick off the discussion, it'd be worth first starting with what and who shapes culture. And there are some what's in there. There's definitely who's, of course, but there's some what's in there. And I think where it's worth starting is, from my point of view, what shapes culture is systems and incentives and behaviors. And that leads us to who establishes those systems and incentives and behaviors, and who's responsible for maintaining and or progressing those systems and incentives and behaviors, right? So there's an architect for all of this, and that's kind of where it starts. But I think what shapes culture, and there's an interesting clip I consumed not too long ago. They were talking about Chick-fil-A and how they have a great culture, right, that drives so much value for the organization. But the host was talking about how really the systems that Chick-fil-A has in place drives the culture, right? So the system of going above and beyond from a customer service perspective, or saying it's my pleasure, the customer service angle, all of those are built into the system that in the playbook that is so consistent from Chick-fil-A to Chick-fil-A. And so, I think it first starts with the system, and then, seeing how the system is influencing culture. But Michelle, what's your take?
Well, it's interesting. I agree with you. I'm curious to know.
Interesting that you agree with me at all, or
no? I think your points are interesting. I agree with you a lot.
There we go. Thank you.
But have you ever been blamed for culture? Because you said you could blame me. Have you ever been blamed for culture?
I always duck and dodge fast enough to not be. But I think everybody has a part to play in culture, right? And if it's part of the system, you at least have a piece to play. But there are people where that responsibility falls, more squarely on, right? And I think those people are the ones that are responsible for establishing and maintaining systems. Again, systems, incentives, and behaviors that, again, drive culture.
Mm-hmm. I was looking for the article. I wrote an article. I was watching the Titan documentary, and it ends on this note of the engineer. For anybody that followed it, so Titan was this submersible that was going to go down and take people on tours to see the Titanic. And the CEO was so gung-ho that it was going to work, that no matter what people said, he was moving forward. And actually, if people spoke out against him, he would fire them or make the environment so bad that they ended up quitting. And the lead engineer who ended up leaving, he lost the lead pilot quit, their CFO, CHRO quit, all of these people. It was like a sign that the culture was starting to fall apart. At the end of the documentary, and this documentary was done extremely well, the head engineer said, "It was culture that killed us." That was like the last sentence in the whole documentary. And it was like so chilling, that comment at the end of the documentary, that it was culture. And it was so true that it really had such a great impact. And who was responsible for that culture? It was at the top of the organization. And it's interesting that a lot of times I think culture falls on HR and HR's lap. Like, you're not creating enough programs to foster the culture. You're not putting a strong enough onboarding together that fosters the culture. I think HR can create programs that help foster the culture, but the culture really does come down to exactly what you said, Dominique, the behaviors in the organization, and the systems that we have in place, right? And those systems are those behaviors, right, that we have in the organization, that we tolerate and that we celebrate. And when we allow these behaviors that are breaking the culture and that allow people to treat people in such a way, either in a positive way or in a negative way, that's your culture. And you can it's amazing when you have cultures like you were talking about Chick-fil-A that are so consistent across different franchises or different, locations. It's amazing. I worked for an organization years and years ago, and they would be all over the world. And no matter where you went, you knew you were in that organization. You could be in Brazil, you could be in Sweden, you could be in Canada, and you knew you were at Axis because they were so intentional about their culture. And they had a great culture, and they were able to work through some of the toughest times in 2008, and they did great because of it.
I think you hit on a few points there that I want to bring in my own example to that and reinforce what you said. Chick-fil-A, I mentioned that, that you mentioned that consistency from location to location, but I like how you changed it as well, because I had a similar experience as yours is Axis. My experience with PwC in New York, when I went to PwC in Shanghai, it was very consistent. I knew I was still at PwC. There wasn't, across geographies, across cultures, you still maintain that I'm still at PwC, or I'm still at Access or Axis or otherwise. And Chick-fil-A, from a customer's perspective, you're at Chick-fil-A, you're at Starbucks, you're at that. Consistency matters. But for organizations that may not have so many, office locations, I think where consistency matters is, do you still feel like you're at that organization during a bad economy as you do a great economy, right? And so that consistency matters in those contexts as well, where you're really looking at can culture still support you, during those bad times when you need everybody to rally, right? You have, again, those right systems and incentives, and then to your point, that influence behaviors that are tolerated and celebrated in the right way. So I think that consistency matters quite a bit.
Mm-hmm. And it's leadership, right? And I think HR can support that. But I was talking to a candidate this morning, and she works at Aroma Joe's. I almost said the wrong company, Aroma Joe's, and she was talking about her experience at Aroma Joe's and how positive it is. And I was sharing an experience I had at Dunkin' Donuts here, and where I was watching, I didn't work there, but I was watching an experience with the leader and an employee, and the employee was almost in tears.
Mm.
And I wanted to just jump over the counter and help, right? The HR person in me wanted to be like, you can't treat somebody that way, right? Like, that employee is not going to want to work for you anymore. And there was no HR there. So you can't say culture is an HR problem. This is a leadership issue. That leader was creating a hostile environment for that employee. That employee was ready to cry. And the leader was just like, just make coffee. And the employee is like, I don't know what to do, because they weren't following the process they had in place. And there was processes in place, there were systems in place, but the leader was just going rogue and yelling at people. And it came down to behaviors. And so the behavior was just fight or flight in that situation. And it came down to behaviors. And I was like, I'm just going to go get coffee somewhere else, because I want to just get out of here myself.
And I think, Michelle, I would have jumped over the counter with you. I would have grabbed a couple donuts first, then helped you address the issue. But I think really, and we're going to segue into this. Culture is a reflection of your systems, right? Culture is a reflection of how you're doing as a system establisher and maintainer, right? It's a direct reflection. Not having good systems, one of the ways that you can judge from an outside in is your culture, right? Are you doing a good job with systems? Just look at your culture and have an honest assessment about that, and then you'll get the answer, right? So you mentioned this tends to fall on HR. That's not their HR is here to help, right? They're here to help, tweak systems and policies here and there, but HR doesn't have the broad authority to go change systems and how people work wholesale. They have to partner with leaders that can do that, right? So, the number one leader that this then falls onto is the CEO, right? If you have bad culture, that's a reflection on bad systems that have been established by the CEO, right? Again, systems and incentives that induce these behaviors that are either productive or not productive in the long term for the organization. And nothing's free, right? Like, you can't just say it's all about systems. People behave however they would behave, whatever. It trickles, it all connects, right? So the CEO ultimately is responsible for culture, systems, and the like. Michelle, anything to add on?
Yeah, my initial reaction when you said systems was like, no, you have to have good leaders, right? But I think you're right. I think it has to be. See, I did disagree with you once.
Ouch.
but I think you're right. But it has to be systems in a way of like reinforcement systems, right? It has to be, the CEO needs to say, these are the things that I'm willing to tolerate and not tolerate. And then we have to have a reinforcement system throughout the organization to put those in place. And because otherwise you're just going to have the eye rolls and people are not going to support it. And that's what we do. We have a culture performance system that we put in place. We start with the CEO, and then we put those reinforcement systems in place in the organization. And that's how you get a true intentional culture. Because if you say at the CEO level, we are going to have a culture where we get back to people. And that means that everybody responds to somebody within 24 hours, even if it's I'm sorry, I can't answer that email right now. I promise I will get a full response to you by the end of the week, but I heard you and I will get to you. I'll finish my response by the end of the week. But then you have a CFO that just doesn't respond to anybody. Your system is broken. You don't have a right reinforcement system. And so then everybody then it breaks down. That's your break in your culture. So then your culture is not a culture of responding to people. Your culture is the CEO is just doing this because your CFO is not doing it. Right? So it really needs to be the things that you, of the CFO, are really willing to die on the sword for. And those other things, you have to just leave it alone.
Here's what went through my head and what's so powerful about what you just said and how this could play out, right? Let's say we're at Acme Corp, right? CEO just gives lip service on it's important to get back to people, anybody, within 2 hours of a message. Now, if that breaks down, you can only assume that's breaking down for customers as well, right? You can only assume that Sally and Bob internally are not getting back to each other in a timely fashion, whether or not they're in the finance function or some other function that's not directly customer facing. You can assume that behavior is slowly leaking through all departments, or is not supporting the departments that need to get to customers in a timely fashion, right? And so if people get used to that behavior, if people see it as acceptable, you can only imagine that's with human behavior, with system behavior, it's about to hit customers, right? Response time to customers is going to get hit, either directly or indirectly. One, through the CFO doesn't do it, so therefore why should I be doing it? But also that thought process starts to trickle. Now, let's say, you're on the sales team and you got to get back to the customer, but you need to get a response from finance on deal terms or whatever it is, right? That's going to impact the economics of contract. And they have the culture, this widespread culture that, we don't really get back to anybody, internally or externally. That's even when the salesperson has the intention of getting back to the customer on time, they can't do it because, again, they're supported by a culture that doesn't respond, in a timely fashion. So you can only see how all of that starts to break down, all of that, and you don't want to be the CEO that gives lip service and no one follows, because again, you have to maintain that authority to push the business forward. But I think that was a great example that shows how a system or a culture, or how systems and culture kind of intertwine, and how that ultimately impacts business in results in revenue and customer satisfaction, potential repeat business, or closing deals in the first place.
Yeah, exactly. Because what we see, we do, right? Monkey see, monkey do. My mom used to say. So, we mimic the behavior that's acceptable. And so that's why, I'm teaching the HR certification prep course. And it's interesting. There's a study that we talk through in there where workers come in and they actually learn a lot, especially like plant workers. They learn a lot initially, and then they kind of plateau, and then their productivity drops. And it's because they come in and they want to show they're doing a really great job. So their productivity is great in the beginning, but then they learn all the bad habits and the tricks, and they learn they can get by, right? So they learn they don't have to be up here, right? They get paid the same if they work at the same level as everybody else. And so it's an interesting dynamic, like what we learn is acceptable in the organization and the things that we're going to do in the organization. And we get paid based upon what we produce, right? We get incentive, and we do what we're incentivized to do. And that's a whole nother topic at the bar that we will have in the future.
Absolutely.
But it really does
Incentives.
start. It's interesting because when I started talking about culture in my career, we started with a bottom-up approach of like, what do we want the culture to be? And we would go to the front of the organization and say, you guys tell us what you want the organization to be, and we'll start a bottom-up approach. And it was a very nice way to kind of think about culture and start talking about culture and building values from the ground up. And I like the approach, but it goes nowhere if the CEO is not bought in to it. And then the employees are like, what the heck? Why is the ship not moving forward? Because then it creates this divide in the organization, because the CEO has to be bought into this. It has to start there. But then the same thing happens if you just have a CEO that's like, this is what I want the values and the culture of the organization to be. And then that goes nowhere. So it really has to be like you said, it has to be the intentions of the CEO, and it has to have reinforcement systems in the organization.
And speaking with reinforcement systems, the way I look at it is the CEO is responsible for architecting the culture, culture basically, and systems that support it, right? But there is an operator, right? I think chief operating officers are responsible for maintaining those systems, right? And so there's the architect and there's the builder. And I see that, again, we're still at senior leadership where it's all about what does the system look like and what gets reinforced day to day. I think what gets reinforced day to day is really under the purview, ultimate responsibility CEO, COO second in line in what's from a day-to-day systems that they design and maintain that drive incentives and behaviors, either in the right or wrong direction that's beneficial or not beneficial to the organization. Culture is something that you cannot ignore because it's a byproduct of how healthy your system is. Mm-hmm. So a great way to measure, your performance as a CLO is to really get a fair assessment of what this culture look like, right? Because that's really a reflection of the systems and the processes that is constantly just kind of getting rechurned, right? And so I think it's, again, maximally important for the CEO to set the right tone, but there's someone that's keeping the cadence and the rhythm going, and the COO, being the operator, the chief operator, has to get a clear view of what they're reinforcing over time, mm-hmm. and what needs to be tweaked about that. So I think a good measure for a COO in assessing the systems that they have, they're producing, is to look at culture and see what does that tell them about, the systems that they have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think you also need to, I steal this from you, continually listen at the fringes and listen at the edges of what's going on in the organization, because it's hard, especially at the executive level, to know it all and really listen in and understand what's going on in the organization. I had a friend, and I'm not going to say any names because he'll be upset with me if I share this, but he came to me and said, I have a client who's looking for time management training. I said, okay, well, tell me more. And he said, well, the CEO continually changes directions for the team, and the team is struggling to meet deadlines. And I said, well, you don't have a time management issue. You have a CEO issue with like a cultural issue. And if you go out with a time management training, the whole team is going to roll their eyes at the CEO, right? Because the problem is the CEO. And so the team's going to say, CEO, like, you're not respecting us if you're saying we're not doing a good job of managing your ever-changing expectations, right? And so the CEO needs to go in and be like, what is going on? What's really going on? And be listening and open to feedback in the organization. And I think sometimes we don't always do that. We kind of think we know the answer, right, at the executive level, because we're not stepping away and leaning in and listening. And I think that's where Vibe is a great tool for that, to lean in and really listen and get an understanding of what's going on, because we don't always know in the seats we sit in.
Yeah. And Michelle, you mentioned it, right? Like, a leader is just far too, think about the CEO, COO, there's a lot going on. And on top of that, having access to information unfiltered, but packaged in a way that's super digestible, about culture or about, a view of your, of what your system's producing. And if it's kind of if it's driving to the right outcomes when it comes to execution and at the intersection of talent and revenue. Vibe, thank you for the plug. It's really, when it comes to being able to listen at the front lines, at the fringes, where things are first, where the cracks are first starting to develop, and getting ahead of it, where you could just plaster it, instead of waiting until it starts to really, turn into a big structural issue that requires a gutting of, a side, side of a building, when it could have just been, fixed by other means.
But if you want to have an intentional culture, you want to know those things are going on so that you have the opportunity to fix the cracks, right?
Exactly.
And to build those systems and put them in place and say, no, we're not going to tolerate these things. And because people are looking and watching, and everybody knows they're going on, except you. Everybody knows they're happening, and everybody's going, why is Michelle not doing anything about this? Why is Dominique? Because they're saying, they're in their minds, they're going, they have to know this is happening. We know it's going on. Why did they not know? And we're sitting there going, everything's great, everything's grand. So these tools are wonderful to help us lean in and listen, because we don't always know. And so it helps kind of bridge that gap and helps us build that intentional culture when we're not knowing what's going on, and making those tough decisions, and then building that trust with the employees, because then the employees are going, finally, something's being done. Thank you for listening to us. Thank you for making those tough decisions. Thank you for addressing this issue.
I very, very key point there is that, people are going to assume that leaders know, when leaders are usually the last to know on some key items that are super important. And again, being able to listen and being able to guide leaders on how to best intervene, right? Because Vibe is going to be a phenomenal process to get information and insights and the story to the leader. But the story, the leader has to act. And I think, Michelle, folks like you are, well placed at any size organization, really, to help leaders think through some of those tricky issues and help them form a consistent response that's thoughtful, and ensure that there's enough follow through. Because I think that's a lot of what's missing is, yes, now you've gotten to the point, perhaps you've identified issues, but that follow through is really key. And whether or not it sticks, and this goes back to our previous session about, you got to repeat something 13 times for it to stick. And that follow through, again, leaders are often super, 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 super busy. Having someone in their corner that helps them think through of consistent message follow through and dilution of messaging is super, super helpful. And any other strategic, follow-ups and interventions that are required. So that's your wheelhouse.
And thank you. And nobody wants to hear that the baby's ugly, right? Nobody wants to hear that the culture, especially when you're trying to build an intentional culture, it's never going to be perfect. Culture shifts all the time, and culture changes all the time, right? But there's core pieces about your culture that you want to keep as you grow. And especially when you're in hyper growth, it's going to shift fast. But there are core things you want to keep, right? Your soul, you want to keep as you grow. And so those are the things you want to make sure you're measuring all the time. And there's going to be strengths that you want to try to make sure you're focused on, and you're keeping those. And you want to make sure that you're paying attention to those all the time. So you don't want to wait to do something, to look at those, to get the feedback until it's too late. You want to keep doing it over time so that you're paying attention to it over time. And so I would say, don't set it and forget it. Like, do it, continually look at it, continually ask get the feedback, so that you're doing it and measuring it over time, because this is something you as a CEO, you as a CXO, you as a CHRO are responsible for. Culture is the responsibility of the CXO. It's the responsibility of the executive leadership team. It's the responsibility of the leadership team. Everybody should be paying attention to it, and it's not a one-time thing. So you should be leaning in and listening all the time and getting the feedback. And it's not always pretty, and it shouldn't always be pretty, because it's not going to be perfect. And you've got to fix all the not pretty things and get the feedback to make it better every time.
Yep. Small fixes as you go is a lot better than waiting for it all to all accumulate, and then you've got one big renovation project that you got to do, rather than you could buy small materials here and there but no, this great. I think we covered. I think the last piece would be, everybody has a part to play in culture. Of course, it starts with the tone set by the CEO, then what's maintained by the COO. HR plays a part in helping form and craft those policies within their scope to help enable those two functions to have a great reflection of their system. And of course, senior leadership teams and then frontline managers have a huge part to play in culture as well. But if it first starts with the CEO, then COO, then frontline managers, again, people don't leave organizations, they leave managers, right? And so what are your systems producing as far as incentives and behaviors with frontline managers that's helping you either retain and develop talent, so that you're not focused on or investing most of your time and energy on finding new talent. You're just focusing more your time and energy on moving up the great talent that you have, which is a lot more cost effective from a time, resources, and money perspective. So frontline managers is another piece. And of course, the general employee, right? It's up to the employee, again, if given the right systems and feedback mechanisms, to speak up through those proper mechanisms, so that the organization has an opportunity to course correct as it goes.
Yep, absolutely. And Neha, I asked Neha to share a couple of articles that actually talk to culture and how behavior actually impacts culture. These are very extreme examples, but you can use those to think through how behavior in your organization at the executive level can impact culture in a negative way. But the reverse is true too. How can your behavior impact culture in a positive way? So think about it as your behaviors in your organization can do that. So until next time, cheers.
Cheers.
You've just experienced another episode of The CXO and CHRO Walk into a Bar, where we share insights at the intersection of talent and revenue. Thank you for joining us. Please join us next week at noon Eastern for more strategic content to help you scale your business. You can follow us on LinkedIn and on YouTube for additional content or episodes you may have missed. The links will be in the comments section. If you'd like more information or to schedule time with Michelle or Dominique, follow the link in the comments section to book time on their calendar. Until next week, cheers.